Welcome to Live with Laura. I'm your host, Laura Hettiger, and today we are going to learn a lot about just about everything because our guest knows a lot about just about everything. If you have been a longtime viewer of Great Day St. Louis, then you have had the pure pleasure of seeing Raffi Andonian on. He is a celebrity historian, and this guy not only has so much energy, he really does know something about everything, and I am honored that he is giving a full hour of his time to educate all of us. My friend Raffi, it's good to see you.
Yeah, hey, this is great to be here.
So I got you here under the idea of talking about President's Day and presidential facts in honor of yesterday. But before we get to all that, I need to know more about you because you're one of the most fascinating humans I have ever had the pleasure of interviewing.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
No, thank you. Let's find out more about you. Please tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I guess I'm fascinating because I am a curious person, so that helps. I've always been interested in learning more. You know, as it pertains to history, I mean, I think because everything has a history, to me, history is the glue that kind of weaves a lot of my interests together. So, you know, I think that history is kind of the underlying, you know, field that goes across a lot of my interests. I mean, you know, my background includes economics. My background includes public presenting, actually some media work. Mm-hmm. In the past. I've, you know, worked at historic sites. And I have financial background as well, marketing. I have all these different backgrounds. It always happened because I was curious about asking questions about what's around me. But all these things have a history and they inform how I articulate myself and also how I form my perspective is what I would say. Because, you know, on the show, on the TV show, we both of them, we've done a lot of different segments on what you would consider traditional histories, right, on certain historical figures and such. But then we've done some pretty, like, kind of different ones as well that you would not think about as having histories. But that inspiration in my mind to even do a history of that and make it fun comes from my interest in other things, which I then simply apply that history lens to. And that's how I come up with these wild ideas.
And let's find out more about your history. Where are you from?
Oh, yeah.
Were you just always an avid reader? How did you get to be where you are today?
So I grew up in Los Angeles, California, even though I talk like I'm from the East Coast. And, you know, I was actually born in Hollywood, which is perfect for someone who's a ham on media, right? Mm-hmm. But growing out west, I remember when I was a kid, you know, the East Coast seemed like this historical, faraway, beautiful place. Now, of course, you know, now as an adult, I know there's a lot of really cool history in the West too, but at the time, that's not what I'm thinking. And so when I was in third grade, I remember reading U.S. history and being fascinated by the founding period of the United States. And now my parents are immigrants. I have no family ties to it. I was just fascinated by the story, the characters involved. And so I asked my parents if we can go out east for a trip at some point. Well, 2 years later in the summer, after fifth grade, we went out and we hit up Philadelphia, Boston, D.C., New York as well. We were on the East Coast. And I was just, you know, I just remember the images, the row houses of Philadelphia, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, you know, which of course now is a big deal with the 250th anniversary of the nation this year. And that made things come alive for me. So yes, I read, but to me, what made it come alive that really captivated me was actually seeing things and being like, wow, this is still here. And that was how I began my interest in history. Now, the funny thing is, by the time I got to high school, I went to a science magnet because, you know, again, I have a lot of interest. And at the time, I was thinking I wanted to be a geneticist. And I went to a science magnet. It's actually rated #1 magnet school in the country now, believe it or not. So we had a very specialized science program in biology, zoology, etc. But then I decided, after I graduated high school, that while I love that stuff, I didn't want to be in a lab all the time because I perceived that working on genetics meant you're in a lab all the time. Went to college at Penn State in Pennsylvania, wanted to be out east. And while I was at Penn State, in my first semester, I took a Civil War history class as an elective. I wasn't sure what my major would be yet. I thought, this is why I came out east, to take a class like this. So I took Civil War history, turned out to be a pretty major historian, Civil War historian. I didn't know that at the time, but I understood that later. Two things came out of that. One, I decided to be a history major. Two, in part because as a result of that class, I discovered that there was an internship opportunity at the Gettysburg battlefield through the professor who was running the Civil War Era Center in Pennsylvania. And so a couple years later, I got that internship. And when I saw that, I realized that I could work in history without necessarily being in the classroom, because I wasn't particularly interested in being a teacher either. I wanted to be out and about doing things public facing, as you might imagine. And so when I saw that pathway, and I just, happened to be in the right place, the state where this stuff was taking place, Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, and got that opportunity, that's how I began sort of building. And so for years after that, I went back in the summers as a park ranger at Gettysburg. That led to working later at Martin Luther King Home down in Georgia, Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was created, as well as some battlefields around Richmond, the former Confederate capital. And one last thing is, while I was there, and this is how things kind of transform and affect your journey, is there was a local historical society and, separate from that, a partner nonprofit to the National Park Service, so two nonprofits in the history land that I was exposed to that raise a lot of money. And when they raise a lot of money, that's how I got into financial stuff and understanding organizational leadership and some of my background there, because I thought, okay, this is great for me to stand here on the battlefield and tell these stories, but how does this stuff actually come about? How do you actually make this happen? Mm-hmm. And beyond the National Park Service, these private entities, and that's where I got into those other arenas that I'm talking about, because I was always interested in the leadership and vision of making something happen, not just engaging with the stories, but I like making stuff happen. I'm like that in a lot of different areas. And so early on, I had that exposure all because of the decisions I made, and I just happened to kind of observe around me, and hence my point earlier on just following the next step and the next step of what I was curious about when I was looking around me and simply asking questions and digging deeper.
I love so many things about your story. The two that really stand out: third grade, you ask your parents to do something.
Yeah.
And they didn't dismiss it as, well, he's 8 years old. A trip to the East Coast would be a big financial.
Yeah.
Bert, I don't know.
Family of four.
Yes, so that's a big deal.
Yeah.
But thank goodness your family did that. It sounds
Isn't that crazy?
It had such a huge impact on your entire trajectory of your life. And then you get to Penn State, also probably because the East Coast fascination, and you decided to just take a class. And isn't that the beautiful thing about college? That you have that opportunity to just see where something might lead you.
That's right, and that's exactly why. Also, for me, everyone has their own set of preferences. For me, I wanted to go to a big school because I wasn't 100% sure about my major. Because remember, I was kind of waffling on the science thing, and I was like, I want to have a lot of options because there's several possibilities I could see here, and I remember sitting in a counselor's office, at orientation, you're as a freshman, you're a week before classes start and you're picking classes, and when I saw that class, like I said earlier, I was like, this is why I came here. I'm going to take this class. I didn't know everything else that's about to come, but East Coast Civil War, I was interested in the Civil War. I was interested in East Coast history. So to me, that's also a story of, you have to remember the purpose for which you came here in the first place. And having that goal in mind, simply just taking the class, for example, and the opportunity was there, I took it, the timing was right. Thankfully, it was early in my time there that it allowed me to shape my pathway, which may have been different if it was, let's say, my final semester there, right? You don't have the same opportunity in front of you. So you're absolutely right. And the funny thing is, now, of course, I think of Penn State as actually in the Midwest rather than in the East Coast.
I do too.
But at the time, your perceptions change over time. But the other thing I'd say, you mentioned about the trip, my parents also allow me to ask them those things, is what I would say. Because another example of that is, I grew up playing violin, and it wasn't something that my parents forced on me. It was something that, again, as a kid, I was 6 years old. We were at a classical concert, and I literally turned to my mother and I said, I want to play violin. And I ended up taking violin lessons, and I played for many years classical violin. I've done some segments at different points in classical history, classical music history, and so on. And to show you how curious and obsessive I am, so to this day, let's say I go to an opera. I used to go to opera season tickets. I don't quite do the season tickets anymore, but I go regularly, symphony, etc. Often I'll go to the same opera at the same place multiple times in that season, so I can technically analyze it in my brain. So that's kind of how much I get into things.
Having known you for a few years now, I'm not surprised by that. And I love that too. And again, kudos to your mom for exposing you to something and not writing it off as, oh, this is something that's just going to pass by. She lets you dive right into it. Speaking of diving right into things, let's find out more about your journey and what makes you a celebrity historian. Because when I first got to know you, that was the title. And I thought, what is a celebrity historian?
I created it.
And why not? I love this. So what do you do?
So celebrity historian, the way it came up is because I had written a book, and that was based on my master's thesis.
Which I have right here.
I actually happen to have it there.
So let's go through it, creating space for conflicted histories, specifically remembering the atomic bomb.
Yep. And
what was your master's in?
So I have different master's degrees, multiple master's degrees, but that one was on historic preservation.
Okay.
And so I asked this historic preservation question because at the time I was working in Los Alamos, I was finishing that thesis, and there was this failure in Congress of a bill for creating a national park, the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, that was to some of the historic sites of the atomic bomb, Los Alamos being the chief place. And it kind of made me wonder, as a historic preservation thing, well, what does that mean? Like, because part of the reason the bill failed was this question of, are we glorifying the bomb by having a national park to it? And I thought that was an interesting question, so I explored it from a preservation standpoint, and I came up with a blueprint of 4 questions to ask, and that's what the book does, is 1 chapter per question about contested historic sites. So it's a blueprint and an approach rather than an answer for a blanket answer for everything, and I happen to use the atomic bomb and a debate around it as a lens through which to kind of dissect it. Mm-hmm. And those 4 questions happened to come in very handy in 2020 when, of course, a lot of questions came up about monumentation and historical memory, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I first got on TV. I'd done public presentations and such, but first got on TV with historical stuff. One of the segments was actually in New Mexico, where I used to live, and the segment was about a monument to Oñate, one of the conquistadors, and there was some controversy around it, and someone got shot outside of it in 2021. And I was in a sort of mini documentary they did, about 10 minutes, like a package on the news, and the book was featured, and my questions, the blueprint was featured, even though it was on a different topic. And, I presented on there, of course. I was part of the segment. Well, it won an Emmy. So that was kind of cool. And so I just kind of built from there and kept pitching and getting on TV. I did it, I didn't have a PR agency. I just kind of kept pitching and doing it. Mm-hmm. And so along the way, early on, I was kind of just trying to come up with fun things. And one time, I think I said something to a producer about celebrity historian. I just kind of thought if it would stick, or maybe it was to a host. I don't even remember. And all of a sudden it went on air, and then people liked it, and I was like, I guess I got something. So I just kind of kept going. I went and got celebrityhistorian.com. Now if you Google celebrity historian, it actually is me because I've been on so many times. I'm 300 plus times, so all over different TV in different markets. And so now, I kind of have been coining the term, if you will. Yeah, It's kind of funny. So that's how you become the celebrity historian. It was based on the media owning Google through television. TV is the ultimate kind of, celebrity maker. And so I just kind of made it fun. My inspiration was actually, funny enough, Dr. Oz when he was doing medical stuff, because, he was a TV doctor. Mm-hmm. And I heard someone call him celebrity doctor one time. So I just took celebrity and I said, what about celebrity historian? It rhymes kind of, and it just kind of is like an oxymoron. You're like, this doesn't make sense together. That's the point. That's why I like to wear the hot pink bow tie too. It's traditional, the history not, but with a flair, and that's fun. So I'm trying to combine different things, and brands, remember the marketing, I have that background, is brands speak through image without you having to explain it. Mm-hmm. So what happens when you look at that? So celebrity historian, if you want to call that a brand, it speaks without you having to explain it. And most people smile when they hear it, and that's what I want, because history is often seen as this dusty thing that's boring. And I want to spin it on its head and kind of, throw you off a little bit, which I think makes it more fun and interesting.
I Love talking to you. I've already learned so much, and I've known you for 4 years, so I'm just even amazed at the things we've talked about in the last 15 or so minutes. I think it makes sense to take our first commercial break, and when we come back, we are going to learn a lot about the two presidents who are from the bi-state, Truman and Lincoln, with the celebrity historian himself, Raffi Andonian. We'll be right back with Live with Laura. We appreciate that you are spending part of your day here with us on Live with Laura. I am sitting down with celebrity historian Raffi Andonian. In our previous segment, you talked about why you wear the pink bow tie. I specifically wore red today because Valentine's Day just happened.
That's right.
The Lunar New Year is today. Red is the color associated with that. President's Day was yesterday. Today is also Fat Tuesday. And I throw all that out because I have a feeling if I threw any of those topics at you and just said go, you would blow my mind with all of these facts. And not alternative facts, not fake facts, like actual facts. You just know a lot about so many different things.
I do, and it's funny. We've done a Mardi Gras segment together. Last year we did one that was really fun. But it's to me, it's not just about facts, right? The facts are the foundation building blocks, but they're not the ultimate point and the ultimate purpose. Information can often be commodified, right? I mean, you can find information easily, may not always be reliable, but you can access information. And yes, I like to go into particular details, but the question is, how do you draw connections between seemingly unrelated things sometimes? How do you create a story from it? And how do you connect it to people today in a way that feels interesting, exciting, relevant, insightful, discovering something? And so to me, it's how you kind of formulate the ingredients. The facts are like ingredients, right? If you're cooking something, and the ingredients, you need them. You need quality ingredients to make it. But then what you do with it, with a dish you create with it, that's where your creativity has to come in. Even the inspiration, as I mentioned earlier, how I come up with segments that are not just on your traditional history topics, but how you do that, it all comes from that, creative process. So inspiration happens at various random moments, like many creative endeavors. It doesn't happen when you're like, all right, I got to do this right now. Come on, brain, be creative. That's not how it works. Actually, that's when it freezes.
Well, I did ask a couple weeks ago if you would tell us a little bit about the two presidents from our area. I grew up in Illinois, so of course, land of Lincoln. Anyone, though, from Missouri loves Truman. They even named the Mizzou Tiger Truman the Tiger.
Yeah.
I see people driving around all the time with their tails hanging out of their cars. So let's jump into presidential knowledge.
Let's do it.
Right out of the gate, is there a favorite president that you have?
Oh, man, yeah, I could do that too. My favorite president?
I am, yeah.
That's a tough one. That is really tough because there's so many in different contexts. I guess I would say, gosh, that's a tough one. Let me go with three.
Okay, perfect.
George Washington, just because as president, his ability and his desire to set precedent in a way that was in line with who he was before he was president, because he was already a hero before he was president. That's why he became the first president. By which I mean his willingness to concede power is ginormous. It's hard to say that, that's hard to compete with. I had to say Abraham Lincoln, Illinois girl. I know you're going to like that because, just his, again, dedication and statesmanship and the moment that he led the nation through, very challenging. And I think he did so very masterfully for a variety of reasons. And the other one I would say, so I guess I'm going to go one at each century, is Teddy Roosevelt, because he was someone that kind of found a way to take what he believed, sort of the Jeffersonian sort of inspiration by Thomas Jefferson and his philosophies, and apply it to the 20th century. He knew how to do that, which I think was really smart. And I love also that he was a well-rounded person. He cared about physical outdoor activity, and he was a very smart person. And he has a resolve. He's very patriotic and has a resolve. Famously, of course, he got shot while he was giving a speech, and he finished a speech before he would receive medical attention. I mean, this is the kind of guy you're talking about. That's hard not to, have as a top. But there are others, too, that I really like. But if you make me kind of say my favorite, that's probably where I'm going to go with this.
Do you ever think what these men that have all been president would have been like if they were just born a couple decades earlier or a couple decades later? All of them obviously had similar skills to reach the highest power in our country, arguably the world. But could Teddy Roosevelt have led back when George Washington was president? How would George Washington and his mentality work in today's world? Do you ever think about that?
Yeah, totally. I do think about that. But the challenge with that is that because it's counterfactual, it's a hypothetical, I can kind of, I have nowhere to prove it. So we could have this, it's great like beer conversation, over a coffee or a beer or whatever, that you kind of, it's fun. But you always have to remember that you can't prove anyone right or wrong.
Right.
It's just kind of a hypothetical. But I do think about that. And the funny thing is, of course, any leader is not in a vacuum. They are in the context of their time. So it's hard to imagine, if you take George Washington in the 20th century or Teddy Roosevelt in the 18th century, them rising the way that they do in a different context. However, the counterpoint to my point there is, yeah, but they wouldn't have been the same person if they were raised in a different era. So how would they have responded? That's hard to say. But I do think that if you're going to kind of have that fun exercise, you have to think about sort of their underlying political philosophies, which is different than their platforms. Platforms evolve, platforms change, positions change, but what's the underlying philosophy? And I would say certainly for George Washington, there is a philosophy of restraint, a philosophy of this notion of honor and his moral character. And that's why he was known as a founder, too, before even as president, and he was not particularly intellectual. Not that he was dumb, but that's just not, that's more like a Jefferson. He's not particularly an orator like a Patrick Henry. He's not a particular writer or the way like James Madison, the way he writes. But his is a character, and so, can that translate elsewhere? If you're a person of character and you put yourself in different situations, can that translate elsewhere? Sure it can. Would it necessarily be as U.S. president in 1920 or 2020 or whatever? It depends. I mean, there's leadership in a variety of ways. Does that make sense? And you can flip that around, too. Teddy Roosevelt, I would say, he had a different way, a more heavy-handed way of preserving what he thought as the American ideal, whether it's trust busting, what he thought was unfair business practices, or at the same time, he thought he was preserving capitalism by doing so. Whether it's kind of a more flexing approach abroad, which I don't think George Washington would approve of. George Washington is of a generation that they don't like a lot of American might abroad. So the platform is different, but in Teddy's vision, he is helping. He's just living in a different world and he's executing the American vision. So would that work back in the 18th century? No, I don't think Teddy Roosevelt's kind of more might approach would work in the 18th century, but he may have responded differently to the challenges around him. So that's kind of conversation you could have. That's kind of fun to have. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And you could go on and on and on with all of the presidents.
Absolutely.
Let's hone in on the 16th president,
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln. Anytime you drive into the state of Illinois, the land of Lincoln, anytime you drive into the state of Indiana, the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, which I always kind of smile at, like, come on, Indiana, he's ours. Like, you have to steal that, come on. But born in Indiana, raised in Illinois. What else about Abraham Lincoln should people know about this amazing president?
I put Abraham Lincoln in two contexts. One is, without the Midwest, this part of the Midwest in particular, or I should put it this way, the Midwest won the Civil War. There's no question in my mind. You have Lincoln, Sherman, who come out of this area. They're all in it. Sherman is in St. Louis. Actually, at some point, he's still buried. He's buried in St. Louis. I'm forgetting the cemetery's name now. The famous one.
Bell Fountain.
Bell Fountain.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have a lot of Midwesterners that contribute. Perhaps the most famous Union Army unit in the East comes from the Midwest, called the Iron Brigade, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, speaking of Indiana. So Midwest is really critical for heavy Union support. And that's one context. The other context, and this is where Lincoln really makes sense, why is that? Why is that happening in this particular part? Because this particular part of the country, by which I mean from here east, just slightly east, like we're talking about the states Illinois, Indiana, going up to Michigan, Wisconsin, etc., are part of the old Northwest territory. Northwest from the standpoint of, the days of Jefferson. And they're seeing this as the old the Northwest territory where they do, in the 1780s in the Confederation Congress, a bill that makes this land, among other things, prohibit slavery. No slavery in this particular part of going basically west of the Appalachians, east of the Mississippi River, so just across the river from us, north of the Ohio River, and up going north. Okay, that's the old Northwest territory. You have about 6, 7 states there today. And it also does this thing where it says any of these territories that come in as states are equal to the original 13 states. That's so radical. Like we take that for granted. But think about the context in which the founding generation is operating. Colonial powers, you have the mother country and a colony that serves it. No, these guys, you're saying you come in and you're totally equal as if you're the original 13 with full rights. Incredible stuff. In that context, Lincoln is born in 1809. Okay, so not long after the founding of the country, he's born in this situation. This is the kind of ideology that he's going to be around in the old Northwest, which believes in free labor. Free labor at the time doesn't mean free labor as in I get labor for free. It means the opposite. It means free labor compared to slave labor. So it means I'm free to work where I want to work. You're free to hire me, etc. And that core is going to come up right in the region that Lincoln is coming up in. As a young politician in Illinois in the 1840s, there's a critical part because he's coming up in an era in which there's this question of how will slavery expand to the Western territories? Well, if you're from the old Northwest territory, you don't want slavery expanding to the Western territories for a variety of reasons, and Lincoln comes up in that context. And so understanding the story of Lincoln before he gets to the White House, but as a local story in the old Northwest territory, then states, and a Midwestern story that is critical to both the cause of and the conclusion to the Civil War, is how I would understand Lincoln as a truly local story. And I think to some extent that's sometimes separated from the story of when he's already there. And that, I think, helps us less understand him. I mentioned earlier I worked at the Martin Luther King home, and one of the biggest challenges that we had, and we talked about out loud when I worked at MLK home, was, and his childhood home, by the way, in Atlanta, so he was aged 0 to 12, I think, when he was there, was helping people understand that Martin Luther King was young ML, little ML, that's always known as ML, when he was living there, a boy that was shaped by his parents, incredibly so, and other factors. And he was a boy, just a regular kid that was shaped, not this towering figure, mythological, that already is giving I Have a Dream speech when he's 10 years old. And that challenge, I think, applies to Lincoln as well. We kind of see Lincoln as this mythical figure, and I think understanding him as a Midwestern boy really helps understand what he does later, including his ideology of we can't have slavery spread. Now, he's not opposed to slavery, and he's not trying to end slavery where it already exists in the southern states for a variety of reasons, if you want, that we can get into, but he's opposed to the expansion of it in new places. And that became the foundation, the cornerstone of the Republican Party at the time in 1854, established that we cannot have slavery expand. And the reason that matters, because go and look at the election of 1860 map. You can Google it and find it, and you will see all the states that go Republican are in the region that I'm talking about.
We are on the same wavelength because I was just thinking, wouldn't it be a pretty even split on if you are going to agree with Lincoln's ideas and vote for him or not? How much did he win by? That's a great one. So part of the reason he wins is because, and there's a series of these in the 19th century. His is not the only one, but he has a plurality, right? Part of the reason he wins, I should say, is because there are 4 candidates as presidents. Okay. So he's not winning by a big margin, winning by a narrow margin. And I would actually
go even further or rewind even before then to the nomination of the Republican Party at the convention, because he comes in third. So conventions are done differently back then. It's not like today you get these delegates as you go around the states. Conventions are literally, you're choosing at the convention with delegates. And there is, a whole kind of complicated process to it, but suffice to say that, he comes in third place in the initial vote in the convention, and the top two guys, basically, they're rival factions within the Republican Party, and they make a deal to go for the third place guy, Abe Lincoln, because it's, I don't want your guy, you don't want my guy, so we agree, neither one gets it, we compromise with Lincoln. So when you hear about Lincoln, the team of rivals terminology, the team of rivals I think is often misunderstood. That doesn't mean that he wanted Democrats in there. What in his team later on when he assembles his administration, he wanted to keep together that Republican Party coalition that he knew was fractured from the convention he came up in. So he has a tight election there. And he was not an unknown. I think he's in third place. He's not an unknown. He gave a Cooper Union speech, a famous speech in New York City that made him a hit in the East, which is why he's able, in early 1860, February of 1860, why by the time of the convention that he's even in a position to be there. So he's not a nobody by any means, but he's not number one and two. He's definitely kind of a second-tier candidate. And so, but then he goes to the general election. There's 4 different candidates. Votes are split all kinds of ways. And he gets into office in 1861 with no Southern states voting for him. So now the Southern states go, well, wait a minute, this election doesn't serve our interests. And that's why they start to secede from the Union. So his margin of victory, his way, particularly the geographic distribution of his victory, does affect the perception of the legitimacy of his election. Now, here's the thing. The Southern states didn't contest that the election results were accurate. They just simply said, doesn't serve us. And so we're out. And Lincoln would say, well, if you're not going to accept the outcome of what you admit is a legitimate election, then you're proving to Europe that a democratic form of government, a republic, does not work. Because the United States at the time exists in a world where they really see themselves as doing an experiment of this type of government works. It's a fragile republic. And there's this notion, and not inaccurately, that Europe is waiting for them to slip to say, aha, you see, that doesn't work. And so you don't want to prove Europe right. You are carrying what you believe to be sort of, the city upon a hill from the Puritans. So that's what Lincoln is thinking about.
So this is the start of 1861. Please walk us through, for people who should know much more about history, how do things develop during his presidency?
Well, immediately before he even takes office, you have the first wave of Southern secession. So 7 states in the South leave the Union. So he already has a problem on his hands before he even takes office.
And at the time, how many states are there? 25?
Yeah, maybe 25, 30, something like that.
Okay.
So you have 7 states that leave, right, in the Deep South. And then once he takes office, and there are shots fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and then you have the next 4 states, 11 states would join the Confederacy, that are the upper South states that join. They say that we're kind of on the fence about this whole thing, but when shots are fired, like, all right, we're going to join. You're forcing us to pick a side now. We're going to join the Confederacy. Now, there's some challenges there, like our state, Missouri, Maryland, similarly. They're slaveholding states. They have a lot of common interests with the Confederacy, but Lincoln really tries to keep them in the Union, and that's part of the reason it gets bloody in both places. So here in Missouri, for example, we've already been fighting a civil war leading up to the Civil War, but the Bleeding Kansas, as it's known. And you can Google Bleeding Kansas and get a basic idea, but basically there's a fight, the border war, it's still called the border war. Missouri, Kansas play each other in sports. The border war between Missouri and Kansas was over the fight over whether Kansas would be a free state or a slave state in the late 1850s. So this question of the slavery expansion, right? And then the Civil War happens, and Missouri's legislator at the convention actually says, we're out. And Lincoln says, no, you're not, and puts a provisional government in place to hold Missouri in place, which leads to a lot of guerrilla warfare and nastiness in Missouri during the Civil War. We are really, really bloody during the Civil War because of that. If you go to South County, there's a Missouri Civil War Museum. says a lot about that. Local institution, you can go learn about it right there. It's really cool. Maryland, just to kind of compare us for a moment, has a similar story. There's a lot of Confederate sympathy there, especially towards the coast of Chesapeake, which practically might as well be Virginia. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of effort to secede from there. Lincoln actually, imprisons some people that are promoting secession at Fort McHenry, of all places, which is where the Star-Spangled Banner was written decades earlier during the War of 1812. Birthplace of the Star-Spangled Banner now is still a military base. Political prisoners are there. And the reason that matters is because, it shows that Lincoln's trying to walk this balance of trying to hold the country together, and he can't afford to lose Missouri and Maryland. These are important places. So, he does some things that take a lot of criticism. In fact, at one point, one of his opponents, Democratic opponents, who's opposed to the Civil War up north, Vallandigham, was jailed by Abraham Lincoln. So, we think so. Team of rivals thing, not so much. Depends on what the rivals thing is. So I think that we think a lot of things today. You asked about today. We think, oh, this is unprecedented. That's unprecedented. I'm like, guys, you look back in this era and other eras, the Republic has done a lot of stuff that would be surprising. And so I think it's important to look at these things to provide perspective. I don't think it necessarily leads you to one particular conclusion. There are many ways you can interpret things, but to provide perspective so we bring down some of the temperature and are more understanding rather than shrill everything is the end of the world type of thing. Because there's some pretty wild stuff happening in the Civil War, I would say. But to walk you through then Lincoln, then to go back to your original question, I'm sorry, was that, he's trying to hold the Union together. First wave of secession states leaves, then the first shots are fired. More states leave, and now he's engaged in a civil war. You have the first shots, the armies are going to take the field, and now you have 4 years of battle after that into 1865. And right as Robbie Lee's army, the prized Southern Army, there's other ones too, but the prized Southern Army surrenders. A few days later, Abraham Lincoln, of course, is assassinated and shot. But a lot of things come out of the war. Of course, the end of slavery being a major, major outcome. And then changes to the Constitution that allow black men to vote.
I've learned a lot. Again, I probably should have already known a lot of this stuff. I wish I would have done a deeper dive in American history when I was in elementary school and definitely in college. We are sitting here with Raffi Andonian, celebrity historian, talking about presidential facts. We've talked about Abraham Lincoln. For all of our Illinois listeners, we are going to come back with Raffi, learn some things you might not know about President Truman. For those of you in Missouri, you are watching Live with Laura. Welcome back to Live with Laura, the day after President's Day. I am celebrating today, too, because I am joined by celebrity historian Raffi Andonian. And Raffi, I've gotten to know you through your appearances on Great Day St. Louis and my St. Louis Live. And as we've been talking, I've just been thinking, I guess selfishly, the fact that I live in today's world and just how vastly different it is, how connected it is. And the media's impact on presidents at different times. I mean, my goodness, you were talking about President Lincoln giving a speech in New York that went over really well. How long, though, did it take for people in the southern states to find out about that speech? Did they ever find out about it? How did the media work during Lincoln's presidency?
So, of course, the media at the time is newspapers. By the time of Lincoln's era, you have daily newspapers, in the founding period, probably more weekly. And by the time of the Civil War era, these newspapers, they're getting news within days, even if they're far away. Stuff travels fast at that point. There were times before that, we're talking colonial period, sometimes weeks. But a lot of times content can be recycled across different platforms. I would say that's a predecessor today to like the AP. Sometimes the AP writes a story and it goes across various AP outlets. But here's what's important about media back then. You have a lot more newspapers back then. It's not like, because you have fewer other outlets. And those newspapers, believe it or not, are generally run by parties. And a lot of times, the newspaper would have a ballot in there already pre-filled for the party that you go submit. And back then, ballots were in the open. People knew how you voted. It's not a secret ballot. So you go and you are going to vote Republican, Democrat, Whig, whatever you're going to vote. You stick that party ticket, that's where the term comes from, into the ballot box, and everyone knows how you voted. And outside of the ballot box, there'd be people that are going to try to guess your vote. This is why you have laws today that say you can't solicit within a certain amount of distance. People giving you shots of alcohol to try to maybe get you. That's why there is election day alcohol laws. But all of this is being fueled by the media newspapers that are definitely have a partisan slant. So, people say, oh, the days of, media was so... Media has always had all kinds of ways of approaches. And in that period, it was absolutely partisan, and they're trying to push their particular guy, and I think that it affects a lot. Now, in terms of the war effort, we think this, TV, for example, which of course I love TV, affected the Vietnam War morale. This is something you hear often. Sure, no question, but not the first time. Newspapers affected the Civil War morale because, for example, we all know Robert E. Lee's army was, of course, a prized army. What's funny is the Confederacy during the Civil War was not doing well in the Western sphere, in our area, in the Western theater, down in Mississippi. Ulysses Grant is winning victory after victory. So why is it that despite most Confederate armies not doing well, that in the election of 1864, when Lincoln is up for re-election, he thinks he's going to lose as late as September, and he's making a plan for a transition? Because there's opposition to the war up north, saying enough of this bloodbath. It's not worth it. We're not going to win. They don't think they're going to win because they're focused on Robert E. Lee, the East Coast Army that has a disproportionate impact on the perception of how the war is going. So when the newspapers, heavily skewed on the East Coast, are writing up that Robert E. Lee is marching around in Pennsylvania and he's still in the field and we still haven't gotten him, it feels to the north that we can't win this war, even though all around this part and across the southern coast from Louisiana to Florida, Union armies are doing great, but not there. So media matters because the newspapers, especially the newspapers that are against the war, because it's partisan like we're talking about, are fueling this. And Lincoln is aware of that and has to deal with that in his leadership.
And it's interesting because there are still newspapers that flat out have Democrat, Republican,
No question.
Independent in the title. That was something I did a deep dive in college about. Let's move to
and I'll say one quick thing, that your little town, because of that, many of those newspapers have consolidated over time. Right. Your little town would likely have a dozen newspapers representing different political interests, etc. So there is quite a bit of variety along those party lines. Over time, they've consolidated. Some names have remained, as you point out. Yeah.
Let's talk about Harry Truman. Okay, what do we need to know about President Truman?
Well, speaking of media, and let's go to Truman. He has that famous moment, exactly, holding up the newspaper headline showing that he lost the election, but he didn't lose the election, right? And so, again, it's just kind of a great way to see how media and the presidency kind of interact. But Truman, again, a very local story. And once again, like I said with Lincoln, telling his story in the context of where he came up from in Southwest Missouri really helps you understand the man. And he's such a fascinating lifespan. He lived quite a long time. This guy came up in a different planet in the 1890s, totally different world than when he leaves in the 1950s with the Cold War. You're talking about 1890s before automobiles are common. He's on a farm, in a rural farm. By the end of his life, he's seen World War II. Not only seen, but obviously actively helped shape. And the Cold War and the global stage, this is a guy that established NATO to fight against the Soviet Union, or to have a shield against the Soviet Union, a buffer against the Soviet Union. Guy who is key architect in establishing the United Nations, hoping for a permanent world peace, because we can't do that again. And by the way, same reason that you have the roots of what later becomes the European Union. Europe says, you know what? For centuries, we've been having these wars. Every few years, we have these huge wars. This one was millions and millions of people. We can't do this again. Let's try for a long-lasting peace. And so these things starting to happen around the world. Truman is a key architect. So here is this guy, global leader, of course, makes a key decision about the atomic bomb. We were talking about the atomic bomb earlier, about using the atomic bomb the way that he did. Globally influential, but he comes up in the 1890s in rural Missouri. How does one transition across those eras? How does one actually inform the other? The younger Truman informed the later Truman, and how does one change over time? Both these guys, Lincoln and Truman, changed their views over time because of what was around them. Lincoln, from having a more kind of hands-off approach to slavery, to saying we got to go and end slavery where it is during the Civil War. He was no longer just against expansion. That's why he writes the Emancipation Proclamation and says we're going to end it in the South. We're not dealing with this again. Because if we make the Union together, initially, yes, he did a war for Union. He was fine with if we could keep the Union together for the American experiment, stay together if slavery was a compromise in the Deep South. But later he's like, no, all of it together because otherwise we're going to have this again in 5 years. We'll have another conflict. So, and that's thanks to Frederick Douglass being in his ear. So he's paying attention to the situation. Truman very similarly. You see, Truman is someone who's changing over the context of what's taking place as well. Early in his life, he had associations with the KKK, something he's criticized for. But that was something that was just around him as a social club. Later on in his life, there's the guy that desegregates the military. The first major blow against Jim Crow, I would say. This is before 1954 Brown versus Board. It was in 1948, a major moment. Do you realize that in World War II, as a liberation army, we were fighting with segregated troops? Most people don't remember that. Most people don't think of it that way. Because we didn't think that black soldiers and black leaders would have the same capacity. It's Truman, the former KKK associated guy, who is actually going to change that. He's the one that puts together the Civil Rights Committee in 1948 that helps recommend. That's one of his recommendations, and he follows through on it. Now, there are places where as a politician, he's going to be careful in. He understands the moment of how far he can push things. It's not like he's saying, "Let's end all of Jim Crow all at once." He understands that also doesn't make sense. There isn't the support for that, but that's a key component of what he does. So how are these guys changing over time, to me, makes a big difference. And one other thing to think about is, let's draw the contrast for a moment. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with whom he ran, of course, for Roosevelt's later term, not earlier, because he was vice president. Of course, for those who don't know, FDR dies in office in 1945. Truman is the vice president. That's how he first becomes president, and then later gets elected in that surprise election. And because FDR is coming from a big New York family, a wealthy New York family, East Coast elite, they kind of look down on Truman. Kind of a guy from the Midwest with humble origins, doesn't have the same formal schooling in the fancy schools or any of that. And what the reason that matters, because there's a little bit of kind of friction there. And believe it or not, when FDR died, Truman did not know that the Manhattan Project for creating the atomic bomb existed. That's how much they kind of blocked him from the administration. He didn't find out until 11 days into his presidency that this project exists, this secret project. That's how secret the project was. So he had to pretty quickly learn about it, and months later use the bomb. So how does someone like that adapt to the situation, and understanding how his belief in sort of those hardscrabble kind of American values from where he came, and how he's going to try to apply that to the world, really makes a lot of sense. And that change over time that we described for both Lincoln and Truman is very important to understand it. Because here's the thing in history is sometimes you hear quotes, if they're accurate, because sometimes, first of all, they may not be accurate, or they're out of context in the document. I see it all the time. Happens with Lincoln, happens with Frederick Douglass, happens with Washington. And sometimes it kind of, you take one line out of a page, it may actually alter the meaning. So you have to be careful to quote a line that is true to the essence of what's being said. You got to be careful. But beyond that, I'll go one more step further and say, even if you were fair to that particular moment, sometimes defining an entire person by that one particular document is unfair because they changed over time based on what they were learning around them. It's a dynamic situation. Truman and Lincoln, our local guys here, are excellent examples of that.
And thank goodness, you would want your leaders to evolve as they are exposed to more and learn more.
That's right. And to me, it also speaks to the pragmatism of the Midwest because, much like Truman was looked down upon by FDR and his crew, and Ulysses Grant, who is from a variety of places around here, Illinois, Missouri, but of course we have one of his homes here in the National Park Service in the St. Louis area. You can go visit. And Grant, part of the reason that he was not in charge of the Eastern armies earlier is because he wasn't the same pedigree as a George McClellan, who had the West Point and the sort of high caliber kind of stuff, trained in the French ways and so on and so forth. And Grant went to West Point, but he didn't have the same kind of perception, right? He's too commoner, and kind of the gruff guy, Truman had the same thing. And sometimes we have to, I think, kind of pay attention to our maybe regional biases, that make and the way we box people in and what they're capable of, because I think those stories also tell you, because without Truman and without Grant, you don't have those wars won, and you don't have a lot of stuff that still influences us today, including around the world.
You mentioned you can't always trust all quotes because maybe they aren't written down correctly. Is there anything you know that either of these two presidents we have been talking about the most, or any of them, when they were growing up, that they said, I want to be president one day?
Ooh, I'm not sure. I don't know. I kind of think of them both as becoming president is a decision to make later in life. Mm-hmm. I don't think of them as thinking that as a child. Lincoln, I am pretty certain didn't. Truman, I don't think so. Because Truman's focus was a lot on independence, where he was, and he kind of came up, kind of more as a local representative. And as I mentioned, I'm not sure he was. Well, I know he wasn't particularly accepted even as VP, so it's kind of a weird tension there. Lincoln certainly not. I mean, both of these guys are self-taught, and I don't think that they're thinking of that from the beginning. They're thinking more like, I'm on the frontier here, and I'm trying to self-learn from borrowing books from neighbors so I could, get somewhere. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So Truman, for example, joins the military. That's one way that he's going, young Truman, to be able to get kind of a foothold, and Lincoln, of course, does a variety of things. So that's what I would say to that. I don't think they were deciding as children, and I would guess that a lot of presidents probably didn't decide as children. I was just kind of randomly thinking off the top of my head of a lot of their stories, and there's kind of a moment where things change for each of them.
Mm-hmm. Because of also the moments that they're exposed to, the people that they're around, and maybe people who also notice certain leadership qualities about them and say, you know what, you would be maybe not a great president, but senator, representative, do something to help other people.
That's true. But also remember that there are different types of leadership qualities that make sense in different situations, mm-hmm. right? So like our conversation earlier about the hypothetical of moving presidents across, mm-hmm. sometimes, because there are different kinds of successful leaders, I don't think all leaders necessarily have the same qualities, right? And so, what may have worked well in this context, you may want in a different situation a different kind of leader. Mm-hmm. Someone maybe more hands-on, more hands-off, depending on what kind of, more idealistic, more pragmatic. Those are different things that you're going to consider that can all have their right kind of area. More instinctual leading versus more kind of logical leading, and of course, in the end, you always want some kind of balance, but depending on the situation, the balance, that equilibrium tilts. It might be 70-30 this way, 70-30 that way. You never want 100 to 0, and it's part of the reason presidents build teams around them. But I think that, the leadership qualities are important, but also are made for the moment. And to me, if I'm taking leadership lessons from that, what I would do as an individual is I would say, are you paying attention to the opportunity around you for what the moment calls for? Not just simply, this is what I do, and this is how I'm going to push it. Because you may be kind of putting a square peg in a round hole, or whatever mm-hmm. the cliche is, So I think you have to be mindful of that. And both those guys, Truman and Lincoln, proved to be adaptable as things unfolded, which really, really, really matters when you think through that. And these things, again, affect us to this day. I mean, NATO's in the news all the time for obvious reasons in global relations. Truman started that.
The EU all the time.
That's right. United Nations, of mm-hmm. course, and these things really. And one more thing I point out is resolve. That's one thing that ties these guys together. Lincoln, through the Civil War, despite multiple blows, and like I said, he's about to lose the election in 1864, or so he thinks, still stays the course. And Truman does the same thing but resolve, for example, with the Berlin airlift. Berlin was in East Germany and is divided in the East-West, and he decides that despite Soviet resistance, they're still going to airlift supplies into West Berlin. And you could look it up and see much more about it. But the point is, he stayed committed to the Allies resisting communism. Very important moment.
You are a very important person that we have that comes on the show, Raffi. Thank you so much for joining us for this entire hour. It flew by. I kind of want to just use you as my own personal history teacher. I have so many more questions. And if you do too, get in touch with Raffi. His website is celebrityhistorian.com.
Yep.
And where can they find you on socials?
At Celebrity Historian on Instagram and on YouTube, at Celebrity Historian. And you'll also find him on celebrityhistorian.com and some tours on there. I do Beyond the Postcard tours. Those are all on there. So you'll find them all on there.
He does everything. Thank you for your time. You are such a treasure.
Thank you.
And friends at home, until next time, thank you for listening, thank you for learning, and thank you for being live with Laura.